they got this stuff they call, they get blood from somebody,
yeah,
and then they shoot you with it.
Oh, so that seems bad.
That's a slow death.
Yeah, yeah.
An easy thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, no.
Suge took me out on the balcony, started talking to me personally. On the balcony? On the balcony, high above, like 15 floors. He had me look over the edge, sign over the rights to him, so that Suge and them could get paid for it.
How much were those points worth?
About $4 million, $3 million, anywhere between there. $3 to $4 million.
And you just signed them?
Signed them and walked away alive.
Whether through legacy or sheer force of their personalities, there's plenty of industry figures who've cut such historic and well-documented paths in hip-hop that they seem more like fictional characters than human beings. And where some people are seen as leaders, anti-heroes, or even tragic martyrs, Suge Knight's role was that of the supervillain. The final boss when it comes to merging the worlds of hip-hop and the gang-related, Marion Suge Knight rose from football prospects to a label kingpin that guided the West Coast to greatness in the mid-1990s. But in doing so, he muddied the waters between where the business of Death Row Records ended and where the street enterprise began. Brash and uncompromising, the years since Suge's reign at the top haven't been kind to his reputation. In fact, he's drummed up so much ill will among hip-hop circles that joiner Lucas pledged for the world to give us Tupac back and take that Suge on Devil's Work. Elsewhere, his status as a music business outlaw has made him into an unconventional pop culture icon. The Baby suggested that he was something to aspire to as a young CEO, while Freddie Gibbs dubbed himself a skinny version of Suge on Alfredo. But when it comes to Suge's position of an exec that ruled hip-hop, his reputation ultimately arises from how he expanded the Death Row brand through conventional tactics. And just one example out of hundreds, just look at how Suge handled an encounter with Bad Boy Records affiliate Mark Anthony Bell during the East Coast-West Coast feud.
So, December of 1995, Death Row throws a Christmas party up in the Hollywood Hills, and an individual named Mark Anthony Bell, a friend of Puffy's, attends this party and is accosted and taken upstairs. Suge Knight, Tupac Shakur, all confront him and say, listen, you know, we're gonna beat your ass until you tell us where Puffy's family house is out here in Los Angeles.
And Mark didn't want to give that up, and they did some things to him.
Taking cues from Tony Montana, Suge's approach to negotiation was unorthodox, but in many ways only added to his label's mystique. When you really break it down, Death Row's run at the top totaled 6 years, beginning with the release of Dr. Dre's The Chronic in 1992 and ending with Tupac's Greatest Hits in 1998. Between 92 and 96, Death Row never released a project that went less than platinum, and naturally, Suge had lofty ambitions for the future. There's $1 billion on top of a hill, and we're running, he told the New York Times in 1996. We're not getting distracted. But while Knight may have been fixated on his goal, he couldn't retain the talent that he had, nor sign any other artists that had the star power of a Dre, Snoop, or Pac. Left with all the name recognition you could ask for, but with no world-beating artist to use as leverage, Suge and Death Row gradually receded into the past. And as one unsuccessful relaunch after another failed, the label finally went out with a whimper after a trip to the bankruptcy court in 2006. Reduced from an empire to ashes, there's arguments to be made that perhaps if Suge had invested more time into the A&R side, he could have had a dynasty and would have made Death Row into a long-standing Def Jam style force of the West Coast. And when you consider how the label got off the ground in the first place, it's more likely that sooner or later the title of hip-hop's Boogeyman was always in Knight's future. By now, it's been well documented that records such as The Chronic, Doggy Style, and All Eyes on Me were bankrolled by seed money from one of hip-hop's all-time top-selling singles. But rather than being crafted by Dre or Snoop, it was Vanilla Ice's Ice Ice Baby that acted as an involuntary fundraiser for Death Row. Working under the guise that Ice owed Mario Chocolate Johnson money for royalties, the incident wasn't quite the scene of cinematic proportions in which, as the legend goes, Suge dangled Vanilla Ice over the balcony of a Los Angeles hotel room. To Ice, the exchange was a lot friendlier, but the end result was just the same, with Suge's general air of menace proving to be enough for him to extort him without the use of force.
He didn't threaten me. He just came in and said, listen, this is my city. You want to play? You got to pay. Everybody else does. He ran off the roster of all these people. And I go, oh, well, I guess I got to pay you then.
Relying more on the prospect of violence than actual brutality, this would imply that the sugar aspect of his name may not be as ironic as it seems. However, Knight did nothing to suppress the idea that he'd held Ice's life in his hands, and along with tales such as his willingness to flaunt the idea that he'd murdered Eazy-E by injecting him with Knight's reputation as hip-hop's boogeyman approached mythical levels, in the process, making him the mainstream's go-to example of the dark underbelly of the culture. From the record label's origins through to the allegations that he secured the release of Dr. Dre, the Doc, and others from Jerry Heller and Eazy-E's Ruthless Records through strong-arming them, Suge's entire rise and fall is filled with actions that resemble something closer to a mafia henchman than a record exec. Built around the MOB lifestyle, Suge protected his business with every technique at his disposal. But while he did what he had to bail Tupac out of jail and liberated Dr. Dre from the unfair contracts of Jerry Heller, comments from Death Row insiders suggest that the working environment inside the label meant that the fear of violence even held his stars hostage. Speaking years after he'd parted ways with Suge, former Death Row security detail Mob James discussed the culture of terror that existed in their Los Angeles headquarters.
A lot of those guys that worked there was scared just to come to work because somebody might just come in here and whoop your ass. Dre was scared too. I mean, it was all those guys, you know, I look at their videos and all that, they was all scared. Why is you putting the fear in these guys like that? They work for you.
Brought to the label by Dr. Dre, this idea of artists being endangered by the row is consistent with the experience of Snoop Dogg. As when Snoop reflects on jumping ship to Masterpiece No Limit Records, the language isn't that of the music industry, but a rescue mission.
And do you realize that saved my life? Like Masterpiece saved my life? I was gonna put an album out called Death Row, and Mac 10 was gonna give me $1 million to put it out. He called me to his office. He said, "What you working on?" I said, "I got this album called Death Row. It's my hard." He like, "Hold on, bro." He closed the door. "You ain't gonna live to see that album come out."
Having pushed Snoop to the point that he was willing to put himself at risk, it's clear that this model of keeping artists on their toes ultimately had an expiry date, indirectly proving Mob James' theory that they couldn't create under those confines for too long. After all, Dr. Dre was willing to lose money to flee from the label.
You coming up there looking for Dre, talking about he owe you some money. Dre left Death Row with zero money, dollars. He walked away. "I don't want nothing, just let me go."
Although unconfirmed, there are also rumors that Tupac was planning his own escape from Suge's clutches before his untimely death in a gangland shooting that, if you ask theorists, Knight himself was responsible for. But when it comes down to it, no man exists as just one thing, and Suge Knight is no exception. As for all the havoc that he wreaked, there's evidence to suggest that Suge wasn't just some polluting force that took from hip-hop without giving back. In fact, he had principles and plans that would have stood artists in good stead not only during the 2000s boom period, but today's era of commercial dominance as well. Interscope was a couple weeks from going bankrupt before they met me. Interscope wanted Dr. Dre, Knight once said. I said, "Hey, I gotta own the masters. We gotta own the masters." They said, "How do you know about that?" I said, "I know the business. We're not gonna be the only ones doing all the work and you get all the money and own it. Modern day slavery, no different." In a way that deconstructs the big screen depictions of Suge as a complete monster. Digging deeper will lead you to stories of Knight saving people's homes from foreclosure. And while Corrupt may have been one of many who has recounted the stories of Suge forcing employees to suffer brutal punishments,
Suge pop him up a little bit, then sit him down in the bathroom. "Where's the bucket?" "Get that bucket. You gotta drink this or I'm just gonna whoop yo for real."
The West Coast legend also believes that he truly wanted to nurture those in his circle.
You know, I love Suge, man, because I'm going to tell you the truth, man. If it wasn't for Suge, man, I don't know where I'd be. Suge gave us a lot of game, and he changed our lives. He took us out of the streets. You know, we get in sticky situations, and Suge always came through. The image of Suge is not really, you know, who Suge is, you know what I'm saying? He always been cool with me, man.
Aligned with Nick Cannon's claims that, in his heart of hearts, Suge was just trying to provide, these comments attempt to invalidate the perception of Suge as cold-hearted. However, let's not forget that Knight's tendency to play up the image that the public had of him wasn't just limited to talk show appearances or declarations of war at the Source Awards. Even after his heyday, Suge refused to shed his hard-edged persona, and in the lead-up to his incarceration for the death of Terry Carter, Knight was routinely sending threatening messages to F. Gary Gray, director of Straight Outta Compton, that were said to have left the filmmaker terrified. Meanwhile, the fallout from his spell at the top of the game is still playing out in courts to this day. Whether or not Suge Knight was hip-hop's boogeyman on a day-to-day basis or simply played the role he was given, there's no denying that he definitely profited from it. As when people expect a certain degree of ruthlessness from you, sometimes you're going to need to hand them some evidence. So, while it's still up for debate as to whether Suge was simply playing the role of mob boss and went too far, or it's an intrinsic part of who he is, it doesn't change the fact that his label made some of the most vital music of the 1990s that continues to resonate with audiences today. And as a result, so too does the shadow of Suge Knight. As, regardless of whether he was as bad as some suggest or not, Suge's behavior has given him a position of infamy in the hip-hop history books that will never, ever be removed.